Hello everyone. Welcome to Voice of Russia for you. I'm very glad to see you here and hope that you are glad to see me here as well on your screens. Guys, today I'd like to tell you a little bit about traditional Russian villages. Most of you probably know that life in the Russian cities is mostly like in the cities of the other part of the world. Because as we know, big cities are in many aspects are similar. But what goes for the countryside, I think it may be a little bit different. So speaking of the traditional Russian villages, I think we should start out with explaining the roots of the Russian villages. And of course, the roots of the traditional Russian villages go deeply into the centuries and centuries ago, I would say. The village is a small populated area that was settled centuries and centuries ago by peasants, by people who decided to join in some communities so that it would be easier for them to work on their land, to farm it, to farm different types of vegetables, harvest them, and provide their living. So, of course, taking into account that it happened years and years, as I said, centuries ago, of course, back then there was no facilities. There was no sewage, there was no electricity, there was no gas, and of course, all these lots of land had no facilities. And what did they look like, these communities that we now call villages? Mostly it looked like a road that divided the community in two parts. So on the left-hand side of the road was a row of houses, and on the right-hand side of the road also was another row of houses. These houses were built of wooden logs in the form of log frames, or in Russian we call it srub. So it's a frame, square frame that is formed by logs put one on another. And traditional Russian house looks like one square house, which is called izba, and the other one, which is called gornitsa. So those both houses are made of wooden logs, and between them is some sort of connection, which that can be literally translated into English as the bridge, and it plays the function of bridge exactly. So it's a bridge between the two houses, and all this construction is covered with one roof, with sloped roof like this. And also to this construction there is another construction connected, which is called yard. In Russian dvor, in English yard. So this yard was used for keeping their cattle mostly, and some other devices and stuff like that. And in the main house, which is called izba, there was a very big stove. It was huge. The traditional Russian stove occupied, I believe, 1/4 of the entire room. It was very big, and it was used for heating and for cooking simultaneously. And also it was used for sleeping on it, because in the winter times, when it was very cold, people would sleep on top of the stove. There was there was a special platform that allowed people to sleep there. Some people could sleep right on top of the stove, and also there was some sort of a shelf a little bit lower, and as I figured, other parts of the family could sleep on other so-called planks, maybe we could say so. Of course, there were several windows, and sometimes small terraces or some sort of porches were attached, and these porches most often were made just of wooden boards, not of logs, and it was impossible to use these porches in the winter time, so it were only constructions suitable for summertime. Well, so now I roughly explained how the village houses look like and still look like. And as I just said, all the houses were located along two sides of the road. Sometimes sometimes villages were settled in some distant places, staying a little bit off the main road, but sometimes they were built just alongside the main road, which are used for traffic transportation. For example, you can drive down some highway, and all of a sudden you see a sign that there is a certain village, and you see that there are two arrays of houses. It may be 5 houses in a row, it may be 10 houses in a row, so it depends on the dimensions of the village. And after that, when the village ends, there is another road sign, traditional road sign, marking that the village has already finished. So that's it. And some, of course, as I just said, some villages were located a little bit off the main road. For example, there are small local roads that branch off the main road. For example, the village where my mother-in-law lives is located on some local road about 5 kilometers from the main road. So these villages were settled centuries ago, and peasants lived there for centuries. They would harvest their vegetables, rye, wheat, whatever, potatoes, so any kind of vegetables to sustain their living. So, and they kept living there. Of course, these peasants went through a lot of events in their lives, because if you look into the Russian history, you will know that there were a lot of changes. At first peasants were free, then they became serf peasants, so in other words slave peasants, and they were possessed by the feudals who lived there and possessed the big parts of the land where these peasants lived. And then in the year 1862, if I'm not mistaken, there was a reform which liberated the peasants, and they again became free. And until the October Socialist Revolution of the 1917, they lived free. But then, after the revolution, the communists came over, and there was a collectivization process. The collectivization process obliged all the peasants contribute their all their stuff into the as a pie of the United Farming Union, which was called kolkhoz, collective farming, so called. So peasants again went into another stage. So in other words, our peasants never lived normal life, probably. Of course, I don't know all the details, but you know, I see that our peasants always had a lot of troubles in their lives. But this is not the point of my topic. So my main point is to describe to you what Russian villages look like. And of course, these days, since first of all, it's very inconvenient, it's very uncomfortable to live in these villages, because there are no facilities except for electricity. Nowadays, the only facility in our villages is electricity, and there is no gas, there is no sewage, so there is nothing of this kind. And of course, if you want to arrange your living in a more comfortable way, you have to dig a special sewage hole, some sort of a bunker underground, to build a toilet on top of this bunker, and then you should call in a special sewage truck that would suck off all the excrements that has been kept in this bunker. And what goes for gas supply, if you want to cook with use of gas, you have to buy balance of gas, charge them. When you run out of the gas, you are supposed to recharge them. So and use this balance of gas. But of course, at the same time, many people who live in the villages use the electric ovens for their cooking. And nevertheless, it's all this way of living doesn't suit many people, and they start leaving the villages. And nowadays we can see that many of the villages are almost empty, and some of the villages are absolutely empty. For example, last year we drove to Estonia through St. Petersburg, and when we drove from Moscow towards the St. Petersburg, until we had reached, I believe, maybe about 250 or 300 kilometers mark from Moscow, they were inhabited villages. But once we crossed this border, in other words, I'll explain it to you. When we had driven far enough from Moscow to a place from where it's very difficult to commute to Moscow, for example. In other words, once we had reached the point where people can only live on their own using the surrounded facilities, these villages became empty. So we would drive, and we drove and see lots of empty villages. So there is a sign with the village name, but all of the houses are dilapidated and empty. So people had left those villages once and for all. Such a sad story. So, for example, I think it's better to take an example of something that we can see on our own. So the village where my mother-in-law lives is about 250 kilometers from Moscow, and there are not many houses in this village, and they live very few people in this village. And I believe that, I think I won't be mistaken if I say that about 10 people live in this village. And probably half of this number are people who moved there from cities, from Moscow, from St. Petersburg. I mean, young people who live in the villages, they leave the villages for the big cities to get their jobs, to provide a decent living. But retired people leave cities and move to these villages, and they keep using and they use now and now they're using these villages as their like sort of suburban houses. And those who have the ability to somehow improve their conditions, of course they dig this sewage holes, they provide running water and stuff like that. But those who cannot do it keep using the wells. By the way, I forgot to tell you that to provide water, all the villages all the villages had several wells inside them. So I think it were maybe several wells on the left hand side and several wells on the right hand side. People would go there, pick up the water in the buckets. So they normally come to the wells with their own buckets. They take the water from the well with the bucket which is attached to the chain. Then they pour this water into their own buckets and bring these buckets to their houses. Nowadays, some people drill deep wells and using an electric pump, just pump this water from this well, and thus they don't have to bring these buckets of water from some distant wells. So, for example, my mother-in-law has a well in her property, just within 10 or 15 meters from her porch. So it's pretty convenient to come up to it with a plastic bucket, turn on the pump, fill up this bucket and bring it to your house. And of course, the situation with roads isn't very nice. For example, if the main roads nowadays, at least around Moscow and in the northwestern part of Russia, have very good quality. I mean the roads. I mean the main roads, but local roads are in a very bad state. Normally, they have no tarmac asphalt surface. Some of them are just made of sand and gravel. Some of them just pure ground and mud. And of course, at least as it seems to me, nobody's going to improve the situation. And honestly, there's no point to improve the situation with the roads, because a lot of heavy tractors work there, and of course, should anyone pave these roads, these mud roads, and the asphalt surface will be destroyed immediately with these heavy tractors. That's why there's no point to wait for any improvement in this area. So guys, well, something like this. I'm afraid maybe I made you too bored with my story, because probably there's not a lot of interesting in this topic. So, but anyway, if you have any questions, feel free asking me, and I'll do my best to respond. And see you next time. Bye.